Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our first lecture in the second unit. We're starting off with the Baroque in Italy. So first off, the term Baroque comes from a Portuguese word, barroco, which means irregular pearl, something that is beautiful but has a flaw. And it is very much a backhanded kind of compliment from the art historians who wrote about this period after the fact. The attitude in a lot of art historical writing for a very long time was that the only truly superior artwork, the best, was ancient Greco-Roman and the art of the Renaissance. So anything that deviated from that was considered to be of lower quality. So the Mannerists got a little bit of a negative critique from the art historians who came after them. Artists of the Baroque, likewise, were somewhat treated by art historians after the fact as being somewhat lesser. That being said, I actually think that you all will enjoy this work even more than the Renaissance work because it has a higher degree of emotional content, expressiveness, narrative. It definitely feels more like the kind of entertainment that is popular now in the 21st century. It is a little bit violent, it's a little gorier in the way that it describes the same subjects that we saw in the Renaissance. It also is the art begin to change and to tackle some things outside of just making what the church wants to see. And we see several artists in this unit who really begin to break new ground and do some things that were quite unusual. So our names to look out for today: Annibale Carracci, all Caravaggio. Caravaggio is by far the most important painter of this era. We'll see our first female painter who became super successful, Artemisia Gentileschi. We'll also look at some architecture by Borromini and amazing sculpture by Bernini. So Annibale Carracci is a member of a family of artists, and that family founded one of the very first art academies. So right off the bat, as we move into this new unit, we're looking at a major change in how art training takes place. As we transition from the 1500s to the 1600s, we start to see the rise of the Art Academy. Now, the Art Academy would allow training for sure, but it also dictated work that were considered acceptable, the types of subjects that artists, in the opinion of the Academy members, should be pursuing. So Annibale Carracci is a massively influential figure during this period. And you can see that even though he is dictating to his students and to that the subject matter of note, the subject matter of importance to the time period is what we call history painting. The history painting category covers topics, very, very restricted topics. Topics that were considered acceptable for history painting were scenes from the Bible, scenes from actual history, or scenes from mythology. By Annibale Carracci, you can see that he is showing biblical narratives, not even sacred conversations, but scenes from actual stories in the Bible. However, he does it in such a way that if you really look, the size of the figures telling the story is relatively small to the overall size of the composition. So he's actually getting away with making beautiful landscapes that have biblical narratives within them. So he's kind of having his cake and eating it too. By far the most important masterpiece of Annibale Carracci's career is the Farnese. Now, this was a private palace. It is the largest room within, and it is his kind of answer to Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. It is a masterpiece of taking what Michelangelo did and just kind of increasing the complexity, the narrative drama of what's being shown. So what you're seeing in this photograph, almost all of what you're seeing is actual paint. Right above this line, where the wall meets the ceiling, along here and here as well. Everything else above painted trompe-l'oeil illusion to fool the eye. The framing around the paintings is all paint. The sculptures behind the paint, all painted. The architectural details, all painted. And in fact, you can see that what Caravaggio is doing is taking Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and amplifying all of the ideas that we saw there. We saw nude figures of human beings beside large medallions next to painted images and with architectural detail beside them. But Caravaggio's look even more fully three-dimensional. Another vocab term that comes up with this one is the quadro, plural, quadri riportati. The translation is framed pictures or framed paintings. We're seeing illusion of paintings in frames on walls and ceilings, even though they are not actual physical real frames. They are trumped. So when you see the overall plan of this composition, you can see that there is an enormous amount of attention to the detail, especially in the framing devices, but there are also more figures per square inch than we saw in a lot of Michelangelo's paintings in the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And it feels to me as though those figures are in much more motion. We see them moving a lot. We also notice right off the bat that scene, but a mythological scene. So when you compare the two images, overall, there are smaller sections. Although his piece is much larger physically, he subdivided it into much smaller sections with fewer figures, with fewer dynamic movements. So Caravaggio's piece really kind of expands the compositional size, fewer images, but more space for those. You really see the comparison here of Michelangelo's Ignudi and the painted bronze illusions, the sculptural and architectural illusions. All of those things are consistent with what Caravaggio's doing, but we start to get this feeling of even more believable three-dimensional illusion happening. The gallery is broken down into a series of narrative panels. As with many of the lectures in this section, this particular point has many more examples than I'm going to have time for in this overview, so feel free to dig in and take a look at each one of these sections in more detail. I just was a glimpse of how meticulous and beautiful and dimensional these images really are, and how much drama has found its way into the storytelling. This is by far the piece I think that you'll recognize most easily. It is the triumph of Bacchus and his, what we call a bacchanal, the figures that surround him that are his supporters as he wed Ariadne. So it's kind of an important moment in Greco-Roman mythology, but it also is an opportunity for us to kind of indulge artistically in this very scene. The most important painter of this era by far is Michelangelo Merisi, whose name is normally given as Caravaggio. Caravaggio was an artist who took, I think, a lot of what the best ideas of the Renaissance were and began to pursue those to his own taste. And one of the things that Caravaggio is really well known for is making the backgrounds much, much darker, to the point that you almost can't see what's going on in the background, but you also see that he increases the contrast, the amount of that is beaming into these scenes quite often feels like you're looking at a spotlight effect on actors on a stage. Many of these major artists, I've included many, many more examples than you'll even have time to look at in the time of certainly. So feel free to come back to this PowerPoint online and take a look not only at these, but at the additional Caravaggio pieces that toward the end. Caravaggio is really well known for these pieces that he was making in Rome early on in his career, most of which feature relatively young male subjects, but they often show you the beginnings of what the Baroque is all about. If you notice, both of these figures are closely art. So a lot of what we'll see in the Baroque is meant to appeal to your senses, to your sense of taste, your sense of smell, your sense of sight. Certainly, Boy with Basket of Fruit is absolutely one of those classic images by Caravaggio that feels as if he is offering us this kind of indulgent basket of delicious fruit, and he's looking right at us. He's really engaging the viewer. That's another thing that begins to happen more and more in the art Baroque period. When you look closely at how meticulously painted the still life of the fruit is, you see right off the bat that very early in his career, Caravaggio has established himself as an absolute master of detail and replication of the real world. He also indulges that are meant to kind of teach moral lessons. This is one of my personal favorites. The image here is meant to represent the idea of a foreteller who is a palm reader telling the future of this much younger character who's obviously more well-to-do than she is. That you might be naive enough to be taken advantage of by someone a little older who maybe has more worldly experience. You see the subject comes up again in the fortune teller. So Caravaggio, like many artists in the Renaissance and the Baroque, made multiple copies of some subjects or slight subjects in order to increase sales. A lot of these genre scenes have kind of funny elements for us. You can see with this one, the character at the far right is literally cheating. He's pulling cards out of his clothing in the back in order to cheat the younger, naive character. There are remarkable levels of detail in these images. The musicians, in particular, has so much clarity that you can actually read the sheet music, and we actually know the actual composer and the score of the song that's being played in that piece. See that we're definitely getting a little bit more drama into the subjects. We're getting more exaggerated responses to what's happening. And we're definitely seeing Caravaggio use the same model to pose for these pieces over and over and over again. This is another example where we can take the name of the composer and even read the sheet music. There's that much level of detail in these works. It's just astonishing. So clearly he could as an artist from the Renaissance, but with a different type of subject, a different type of attention here. Most of these scenes begin to appeal to either your sense of taste or smell, in this case, your sense of wine. Look at the ripples in the wine glass. This is one of his most images of the Bacchus, and it's a little suggestive. He seems to be kind of undoing his robe there while he hands you this rather full and rippling glass of wine. The fruit in the still life is right at the edge of the table, right close to the picture plane, and his arm is very much foreshortened, as if he's reaching right out of the canvas to directly hand that wine to you. This is one of Caravaggio's studies, which I really love. It is not only a beautiful picture of still life of fruit, but look at the bottom edge. Look at how the basket itself hangs over the edge of the table or shelf that it sits into our space. It's as if Caravaggio wants to break that illusionary wall between us and the art and make it feel as if the art is actually the real world and it's in our space. He is definitely aware of the impact of mythological subjects, and this is one of his variations on the character of the Medusa, the character who could turn you to stone. This is one of that he creates, but it's kind of a remarkable painting. There's actually two of them. They are painted shields, canvas over wood, and they are convex. They actually bow outward. We know from looking at both versions, this is my favorite of the two, that he not shying away from the grotesque, monstrous, frightening aspects of the character. But even more remarkable, we know that Caravaggio didn't do And in fact, in scans of this piece, you can see that he began it directly in paint and made changes to the proportions as it went along. Really pretty remarkable. We've seen this particular saint before, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, but we haven't really seen her in as simple a where the background is just this dark, kind of shallow space where we can't automatically tell. I assume she's indoors, but there's not a lot of detail that happening. It really is as if she's an actress on a stage with a spotlight. And that continues throughout a lot of the biblical images that Caravaggio is known for. In fact, we refer to this lighting scheme quite frequently as cellar lighting, as if the light is coming in from a window on the wall, as it would be in a basement or a cellar. This piece is one definitely to keep in your mind, not only because it's so shocking, its violence and its drama, but because we will see this very subject taken up by a female artist. It will have even more power in her hands. So think about this one when we see the version of the same story painted by Artemisia Gentileschi. You definitely get a feeling of what Caravaggio is about now, right? Dark, mysterious backgrounds, spotlight, cellar lighting, and he also starts to give us a feeling of the real world. Instead of these idealized saints who look kind of the way we do in reality. This is one of his most important commissions, and the painting that you see in the center there is a painting of St. Matthew writing his gospel. And you notice that the corner of the stool or desk that he's sitting at extends out. It hangs and casts a shadow over the frame, almost as if he is three-dimensional himself. And you see that a lot in Caravaggio's work at this time. Probably the most important painting from that cycle is this one, The Calling of St. Matthew. And you see here, Christ is pointing toward and calling a disciple who has yet to join him. So really in this moment, Matthew is going to make the decision to follow Christ and to abandon his tradition to go into this spiritual service. But what is really remarkable about the painting is that the character of Jesus is in biblical garb, but all of the other characters are dressed in late Renaissance, early Baroque fashions. Men wearing very close-fitting tights with larger shoulder padding. Those detachable sleeves with the slashing through that we talked about before is very evident in all of the figures surrounding Matthew. We also have a of the cellar lighting, that light coming in from above and creating a spotlight. We know exactly who Christ is talking to, not only because of the lighting, but because he gestured toward himself as well. Within this same chapel, we have the painting that we referenced earlier of Matthew writing the gospel. I just wanted you to see the original version of it. Unfortunately, it ended up being destroyed in the Second World War, so all we have of a record of it is black and white photographs. But you can that the original version is actually the one that the church rejected. They felt that it was disrespectful to the Saint Matthew. The reason, if you look at the way the angel is holding his hand, the image is meant to be Matthew writing the gospel, and the gospel is meant to be the direct word of God. So in Caravaggio's version of this idea, an angel appears and physically manipulates Matthew's hand to write what God him to say. That to me is a very real and believable and touchable way of showing a spirit this higher power. Remember, even in the Renaissance, the stories of the disciples are quite old. It is well over 1,000 years since these people have lived, and so to make them feel like they look like real people you could relate to, and to make a miracle feel like it's something you could experience in your own life is really the power that Caravaggio has. Now, the church felt that this was a little bit too much dependence on the angel, that the saint himself didn't seem to be the author of what was happening. So in the completed version, the accepted version, you see that he is writing and listening. It's more of a conversation. The angel's still kind of dictating to him, listing things on his fingers, what to say, but we feel like the a little more involved. I also really love in the original version how this kind of foreshortened leg, especially foreshortened foot, seemed to just burst out of right toward us. It's really just a remarkable series of images. His second most famous altar paintings are from the Charasi temple, and they're indicated there with the arrows. Those images are the conversion of St. Peter and, crucifixion of St. Peter and conversion of St. And they are masterpieces of Caravaggio's cellar lighting style. We sometimes even refer to his technique as the dark, because there's so much dark shadow in the background that the figures kind of fade into it, and the spotlight only picks out the main and most important characters. Peter, notably, wanted to be refused to be crucified right side up because he felt it was disrespectful to Christ crucified upside down. Paul is the one you may remember from the story of the Damascus Road. The light and power of God appear to him and literally knock him, and he converts and changes his life kind of on the spot. And that's exactly what you're seeing there, is if the light has just literally knocked him right off the horse and onto the ground right in front of us. But the thing I love about what Caravaggio does is he gives us these details really close to where your eye level is, of these dirty feet and these commoners, this anguish of and ecstasy of the figure of Paul. You get the feeling that these real people in a real space that you could inhabit. And it absolutely carries over into subjects like this. There are a lot of Caravaggio paintings where Christ appears to disciples after the crucifixion and entombment, after the resurrection, and they react in kind of shock and surprise. But you see how much foreshortening is happening in the arms, and even as the fruit basket itself seems to come off the table into our space. Caravaggio's subjects feel very personal to us in a way that the Renaissance really didn't. The Renaissance kept everything in kind of overall bright colors, overall clear lighting effects, definitely with light and shadow, but not nearly as much extreme. Obviously, Leonardo into some dark shadows, but Caravaggio and his followers really take that even further. One of my personal favorites of Caravaggio is Doubting Thomas. In this image, you can see that Christ has appeared again after the resurrection, and no one can believe that he's really who he claims to be until, in this case, Doubting Thomas literally has to touch it to be able to believe what his eyes are telling him. It, to me, is gruesome, certainly, but at the same time, it makes this event, this person, this history feel real and feel if it is something that you could relate to in your own lives, as opposed to this kind of ancient and magical image of God or Jesus you can't relate to as directly. The art of the Baroque really makes it feel like you could have a personal, direct, even with God himself. So Caravaggio's paintings very often have models that reoccur that for images by the artist. Very often they focus on the corporeal, the bodily. Very often they put us right at ground zero of an image that is projecting into our space, and makes an extreme use of this dark background and cellar lighting effect. These again and again throughout his career. I think one of the things he's best known for, though, is this idea of making common people feel like they could be angelic and biblical and holy characters. And I think you see that again and again and again in his work throughout his career. He definitely gives us a very dramatic lighting effect, particularly here in the image of St. Jerome, that feels almost like you really are looking at maybe a movie or a music video or an actor on a stage in a really dramatically lit scene. It just increases the tension and the drama history of these images, and you see it again and again in what Caravaggio is able to produce. He was even criticized for this painting. There's a legend, images of the body of a drowned prostitute as his model for the dead body of Mary. We don't have accurate proof that that is exactly what he did. However, we do have a feeling that he looked at reality in order to make this And definitely Caravaggio was concerned with the real world. Caravaggio actually does have a very fascinating personal history. He was far less religiously active than the paintings might suggest. He was into lots of arguments, fistfights, and at one point even killed a man in a duel. And over the course of his career, he sometimes fell afoul of the law. He was quick with his temper and with his anger, and he very often lash out at people he felt had wronged him. There were definite occasions during his life where he was forced to leave a place attitude. And in fact, he was forced to flee. Having been in Rome, he was at one point in a very severe argument. There's some evidence that it may even have devolved into Caravaggio getting his friends, followers to act a little bit like a gang, to corner his opponent, and they end up in a duel, and he ends up actually killing a man. So he ends up on the run from the law. And of course, murder is a terrible crime, but he tries to, for the rest of his life, he get good with the Pope. He continually tries to do actions that will get him somehow pardoned. And he does actually get a pardon from the Pope, if you can believe it. But one of his strategies is to leave Rome, and eventually he ends up on the island of Malta. He starts to make paintings for a group of knights who still exist, actually, the Knights of Malta. And one of the things that they were responsible for protecting the rest of Italy from any invasion from Islamic forces. And so in his paintings for the Knights of Malta, you see kind of an increased sense of the physical dangers and drama of the storytelling, but also you get a feeling that he's trying to impress not only the knights in order to become an official member of their group, thereby gain papal forgiveness. You get a sense that he is grappling with some personal issues, I think, in these paintings that can be rather gruesome. Definitely the period in Malta, when you really look at these images, you get a feeling that he is trying to make himself better, or he's trying to ally himself with a powerful force. You can see here the coat of arms that's been included. If he's reminding even his own patrons, hey, I'm doing this for you. I'm one of the club. I'm trying to become even better. Please accept me and see. He ends up actually eventually ticking off the Knights of Malta, and they put him in prison, and he stages a prison break and escape, if you can imagine that. So this guy had an incredible career in terms of being a fantastic artist who pushed the boundaries of what art could do. Was also, I think, probably a really difficult person to live with or to cope with. And you can see that, I think, in some of these paintings, the intense is maybe more than some of us would be able to cope with in a day-to-day relationship, I'm sure. So sadly, Caravaggio does eventually get papal forgiveness, and he's on his way back to Rome, and unfortunately does not make it back. He actually dies en route back. That brings us then to Artemisia Gentileschi, and Artemisia is the daughter of a painter, and that's about the only way that a female artist would be able to get training during this period. Even though we've now moved from the apprenticeship system to the academy system, really the mothers of talented young women were not likely to allow them to go into this field. So still during the Baroque, even though it is more than what we've seen in the Renaissance, it is still a bit of a restricted access to training and to opportunity. So that is never to say that women aren't capable of being great artists. And in fact, Artemisia proves how fantastic a female artist can be. Resources. And that, I think, is a really important point for us to think about. It's not so much that there aren't women artists. It's did they have access to the kind of materials and training and to the jobs to be able to show what they could do. Now, Artemisia has a really dramatic life story as well. Her father sought out extra training for her and hired a tutor to help her with perspective and drawing. And he was a monster. Her drawing tutor sexually assaulted her. And she objected. She did not take it silently, even though her father's first method of trying to cope with the situation was to suggest to her that she should marry her assaulter. Had his way with her sexually, what other man would want her? It was a brutal moment between the two of them. And in fact, she was distant from her father emotionally and physically for quite a long time. They did heal their relationship toward the end, but there was a great rift between them over this issue. Pressed charges. And of course, they didn't have the type of evidence or system of justice that we try to use today. DNA evidence, for instance. So one of the ways that they tried to prove that her story was true or false was by subjecting her, the victim, to a form of torture. They put her hands or her thumbs into what we call thumb screws. They're kind of like objects used to press oil out of a piece of fruit. They lock down on your thumbs and increase the pressure until the bones break. The theory being that no one would subject themselves to that level of pain and maintain a story unless it. So there's a legend about the trial that at one point, as she's in the witness box, she holds up her hands with the thumb screws on and says to the rapist, "You wanted a wedding ring. This is as close as you'll ever get." It's a remarkable story. Now, Artemisia also a lot of this passion into her painting, and a lot of her subjects are female characters from biblical narratives who take act. Remarkable to see her take on a story that we saw Caravaggio attempt earlier. These are paintings of the story of Judith, and Judith is one of the few female characters in the Bible who actually takes action like an action hero. Her homeland is under attack. She sneaks into the enemy camp. She seduces the enemy general, drunk, and then beheads him. And it is really kind of remarkable to think that this story has not been shown as frequently to you, perhaps, as some of the other biblical stories. Michelangelo included it in the Sistine Chapel, ironically, and we Caravaggio take on the story. Artemisia's father takes on that painting as well. That's his painting on the left, her version on the right. And you see she returns to that subject again and again. This is Caravaggio's version of the actual beheading, but look Artemisia does with that subject. In this one, we see that the head has been severed. We see Judith's maid trying to hide the head in a bag so they can carry it out, and you can see that the hero, or heroine, I suppose, of the story, Judith, is gesturing to keep everything quiet so that they can make their escape when the moment is right. That version of the story, though, pales in comparison to this one. This is before the test. This one is Judith slaying Holofernes. It's one of several paintings she made on this subject. And you can see here that not only is Judith very active and powerful in the way that she is attacking and severing the head of the enemy, but you can see the servant is also really involved in actively holding him down. And you can see quite a gruesome arterial blood spurt happening there as she way at the neck of the very clearly awake and aware Holofernes. It's much more personal, direct, and intense, I think, than Caravaggio's. It's not that it's bad, but look how far away her body is from his. She almost looks like she's slicing cheese compared to this one. Look at the determination on her face. She knows exactly what she's doing. She's really taking her power back. plenty of other artists, Italian Baroque artists, that are important, and plenty of examples, more than we have time to look at, but a lot of the themes that, and again, biblical themes for sure, mythological scenes, and certainly paintings on ceilings continue, and they get more and more elaborate with more and more movement. This is the work of Domenichino Lanfranco, an artist, Guercino. It's a nickname that means the squinter, so probably he needed to have better glasses. But I wanted you guys to see this painting because it's just so remarkable. You see that the painting is primarily trompe-l'oeil illusion above this line of the cornice of the room itself, painting from the right point of view, from the very center of the room straight up. The illusion of that painted architecture becomes a perfect one-point illusion if there is no ceiling, and the chariot of the sun god is going across. We can see directly up into the bellies of the horses as they go over our heads. It's an incredible illusion of space. We call this point of view actually di sotto in su, meaning seen from below. The horses in profile, we're seeing up underneath them, up underneath the chariot. It's really a remarkable illusion of three-dimensional space. Quite a beautiful accomplishment. The paintings become more and more elaborate, and you can see that here. You can see, again, this is the work of Andrea Pozzo, but you can see that there is painted architectural illusion happening in this ceiling. This is definitely meant to be seen from one specific point of view, and if I put you in that point of view, that one-point perspective is absolutely perfect. But now we've taken Michelangelo's idea of a painted ceiling from the Renaissance and exploded the ceiling away, as if these figures just float straight from our world straight into heaven. They're just absolutely remarkable accomplishments. And there are many artists doing the very same type of illusion to really push the dramatic, what an altarpiece could be, or rather in this case, a painted ceiling in a church or in a chapel. Really very remarkable and beautiful. Now, speaking of the chapels themselves, how about the architecture? The architecture begins to change as well. Borromini is the best known architect of the Baroque in Italy, and his architecture really takes on more movement and more drama than we saw in the Renaissance. Notice how many curves there are in this work. You ceiling inside the chapel, and you can see that it is an oval with lobes, that it also has a massive amount of recessed detail in the dome element itself. But the entrance to this church is pretty fascinating as well. It undulates, it moves like a curve in and out of space. Clearly, the entrance is the architectural facade or face of the building, dictates to you where to go. But notice that that doorway is actually where you would normally expect it to be. It's actually kind of on an angle. The building incorporates this on its corner. This is one of 4 fountains, and the other 3 are on the other 3 corners of the intersection that you see here in this photograph. Hence the name of this church, which is San Fountains, or alla quattro fontane. There is an illustration from when the church was first debuted. You can see the entrance is on an angle, completely flat or square to either of the 2 intersecting streets. There's 1 of the fountains, 2, this is 3, and you can't see 4, but number 4 is there. And these are the fountains themselves. And again, incorporating ideas from the Roman Empire, from Greco-Roman. We're finding all of the past with the current belief system in these works. Really pretty remarkable. Borromini was one of the leading architects, but he also sometimes lost out on commissions to Bernini. Bernini was also very active, but also very importantly in sculpture. And it's really the sculpture that I want us to take a look at. His sculpture really picks up where Michelangelo left off. There's all of that attention to anatomy and to the believable proportions of the body. This figure could almost be Michelangelo's Moses. all the way back to our example that was uncovered when Michelangelo was alive, the sculpture of the Laocoon looks very much like that main figure, but in far more movement. And obviously, these sculptures are meant to be seen from multiple points of view rather than from one fixed point of view. Look at his fingers pressing into her flesh. Just absolutely remarkable. The Bernini sculpture, to know for the test, is his version of David. So again, we're looking at similar subjects we saw in the Renaissance being done in a new way. And with David, with Bernini's version of, notice there is no severed head under his foot, so we're not at the end of the story. But we're also not quite at the beginning of the story. We were with Michelangelo's version, where it seemed that David was looking at Goliath and thinking about what to do. Here we see David with the rock in the action of hurling it at the enemy. This is a figure frozen in a nanosecond of extreme movement. Expression on his face looks a lot like the kind of grimaces that you'll see in sports photography when people are really exerting themselves and they're captured in a nanosecond. You can see all of that energy and power in what Bernini is able to do. Look at how dramatic the piece is from multiple different. It's just an astonishing vision of this story, and it puts us now in a place where we can clearly see the difference between the Renaissance and the Baroque. The Renaissance is beautiful, but it is centered in the mind. It's about the possibilities of perfection. It's centered in the body, and it's about action in the moment. We are still talking about morality in the artwork that we're also talking about people actively going about changing the world, physically engaging. And that's, I think, a big difference between the two eras. Michelangelo's is about the planning, the thinking, the intellect. Bernini's David is about the body and the Bernini piece absolutely to know, maybe my absolute favorite of his is this piece, The Ecstasy of St. Teresa. St. Teresa was canonized nun. She was a nun who became sainted, and she became a saint because of the miracles that she experienced being carried physically up to heaven by the announcing angel, who plunged flame-tipped arrow into her heart over and over again, plunged it in and out, causing her agony and you can certainly imagine kind of a Freudian sexual interpretation to that story. Notice Bernini has pulled back from any sense of that. Instead, the angel is very gently holding the arrow very far back from her body, but notice that he is very lightly holding her, just by one finger and a thumb of the habit, the nun's robes or clothing, and she's reclining on clouds. This entire image actually appears to float. Carved stone. It's an altarpiece that's not a painting that appears to float, and it is witnessed by these flanking sculptures for it. They look like they are in opera boxes looking at a stage. Can you see them here? Looking in toward this centerpiece. There they are. You can see it looks as if she's floating, and it also looks as if light is literally pouring in on them from heaven. That's because there's a hidden window back there, clear glass, that lets light shine down on these gold bars. This entire architectural setup and all the executed by Bernini. What a genius. Again, there are many more examples than we have time to look at, but I did want you to be aware of some of Bernini's contributions to the evolution of St. Peter's. We saw Michelangelo the last time we looked at Peter's. We saw Michelangelo's design for the dome. Bernini contributes these two items, the baldachin, which is the canopy that covers the space that the Pope will sit at, but also this amazing colonnade or series, a row of columns that extend outward from the facade of the church and form these large curves that basically act almost like the arms of the church reaching out to draw you back in. And important point about the Baroque itself. At this point, we are now in the 1600s, so of course, of changes happening in the world. We met Henry VIII in the Renaissance in the last unit, and Henry VIII broke away because he wanted to be able to get divorced, right? So we had one of our first Protestant churches formed in England, the Church of England, of which King was the head of the church. So we're seeing various Protestant groups peel away from the Catholic Church, still Christian, but practicing. So the Catholic Church has to respond to this. We call the movement of Protestantism at this time the Reformation, and the Catholic response is the Counter-Reformation. So you could think of Caravaggio's paintings as trying to appeal directly to people to make them feel that they're Catholic Church. You could look at these architectural arms of St. Peter's by Bernini as literally reaching out and trying to hold you in or hug you or draw you in, bring you into the church itself. It's really pretty remarkable.